Welcome to Houstonic.live, episode 280.6. This corresponds to chapter 6 in the book by Judith Miller and Stephen Engelberg and William Broad called Germs, which was released September 7th, September 9th, year 2001. What we're doing in this series is we are capturing the full narration of the book, of the PDF. You can actually find here, and we're going to be keeping on the screen as the audio plays. A majority of the audio has been captured in the Amazon audiobook for Germs, as I reviewed in the previous episodes for this particular series. Unfortunately, as we have discovered as we've been playing it, one, the chapters in the audiobook that's available on Amazon Audio do not align at all with the book chapters. And number two, large sections of the book are not captured in the Amazon audiobook. There are a few sections which have been reworded, and when I can identify those sections and the rewording is improved, I'll go with the Amazon audiobook version. However, there have been large sections that have been completely omitted. Just to review, one of the most alarming sections that we found, it was in chapter 4 or 5, highlighted how Philip Zelikow, a man who is actually went on to become the executive director of the September 11th Commission, or the 9/11 Commission, was actually being used as a source for this book on the potential of biological warfare and how the U.S. is going to respond to it, preparing for vaccines and all of that stuff. That was published, meaning made available for sale, September 7th, September 9th, 2001, just days before, hours before, in some ways, the attacks of September 11th in 2001. And there's many other sections as well that the narration was just missing from the Amazon audiobook. So by listening to this series, you'll be able to capture as much of it as possible. And from time to time, we will actually add additional information, additional color, maybe take a few minutes here or there to provide some background on a historical figure or a technology or a biological concept or something of that nature. But only as much as is necessary, or perhaps we will reference other work that has been done on Houstonic.live, which you could view and will also help provide some additional background and additional color. The Amazon audiobook at chapter 3, minute 49 and 17 seconds, corresponds to the beginning of chapter 6 in the actual book. Each episode of this series corresponds to one chapter in the book. So 280.6 will correspond to this chapter, chapter 6 in the original book.
On Sunday evening, March 19, 1995, wire services began sending urgent bulletins from Japan saying thousands of people had been sickened in the subways during their Monday morning commute by a mysterious gas or toxin.
Richard A. Clark, the White House official who handled terrorism issues, immediately called Frank Young of the Department of Health and Human Services for a scientist's assessment of what might be unfolding in Tokyo. Clark described the early, sketchy accounts to Young, a microbiologist who headed his department's Office of Emergency Preparedness. I thought I'd provide a little background on Frank Young. There is a page for Frank E. Young on Wikipedia, and I believe this is the same Frank Young that is referenced in this book. I can't even believe this level of omission. Frank Young was an American physician who served as the commissioner of the FDA from 1984 to 1989, and later as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the United States Department of Health and Human Services. In 2013, he joined Braeburn Pharmaceuticals as Executive Vice President, Clinical and Regulatory Affairs. In 2018, he became the Executive Vice President of the Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at Tissue Tech Incorporated in Syracuse, and a PhD in microbiology from Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio in 1962. He completed his residency in pathology at the University Hospitals and Western Reserve University, and went on to become the chairman of the Department of Microbiology and professor of microbiology, pathology, and radiation biology and biophysics at the University of Rochester. Before his appointment as commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, he was Dean of the School of Medicine and Dentistry and Vice President for Health Affairs at the University of Rochester. Young was sworn in as the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration by Secretary of Health and Human Services Margaret Heckler on August 2, 1984. During his tenure, Young presided over several major agency events, including the Drug Price, Competition, and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, passage of the Prescription Drug Marketing Act of 1987, approval of the first drug to combat AIDS, commonly known as AZT, in 1987, development of the treatment use of investigational new drugs for the desperately ill, such as people with AIDS, cancer, and heart disease in 1988, managing the generic drug crisis in 1989, during which 3 officials of the FDA pleaded guilty to receiving bribes and 2 manufacturers of generic drugs admitted to providing false data, and the 1989 Chilean grape scare, where Chilean grapes were temporarily banned by the FDA because of a threat and discovery of 2 cyanide-tainted grapes. Frank Young left the FDA in 1989 to become Deputy Assistant Secretary for Health, Science, and Environment under Health and Human Services Secretary Louis Wade Sullivan. Subsequently, Young served as director of both Office of Emergency Preparedness and the National Disaster Medical System during the Clinton administration from 1993 until his retirement from federal service in 1996. In 2013, Young joined Braeburn Pharmaceuticals as Executive Vice President, Clinical and Regulatory Affairs, to contribute to the development of the new drug application, or NDA, to FDA for evaluation of Braeburn's Probufen implant, which was approved on May 26, 2016. Probufen is the first buprenorphine implant for the maintenance treatment of opioid dependence. Frank Young died of lymphoma on November 24, 2019 in Wilmington, North Carolina at the age of 88. Can you imagine that? Not even mentioning that this guy was the director of the FDA.
Now that we've established some background on Frank Young and this rather shocking omission that he became the director of the FDA, and remember, that would have been before this book was written by 15 years or so, let's just restart Chapter 6, The Cult, so it has better flow. But first, here is a couple-minute video on YouTube just to give you a little bit of a background on this particular event, this terrorist event in Japan back in 1996.
It was rush hour when the sarin gas began to spread through Japan's subway system, released from plastic bags onto 5 crowded trains. 13 people were killed and some 6,000 others made violently ill in the attack, deemed the worst act of domestic terrorism in Japan's modern history. 2 months later, Japanese authorities arrested Shizuo Matsumoto, a man better known as Shoko Asahara, the leader of the so-called doomsday cult Om Shinrikyo, meaning supreme truth. The self-proclaimed guru, who was nearly blind, founded his cult in the mid-1980s. Asahara predicted that Armageddon would occur in the 1990s and told his followers that they would create a new world. By the time of the Tokyo subway attack in 1995, the cult had 10,000 followers in Japan and some 30,000 in Russia. Devotees included doctors and engineers who produced the chemical weapons used to carry out the group's crimes. While Asahara built himself on charisma, he spoke little during his trial, muttering incoherently without ever explaining his motivation. He was sentenced to death in 2004, along with 12 followers. Asahara's cult eventually disowned him and disbanded, but Japanese authorities say splinter groups remain active, with some 1,600 members.
On Sunday evening, March 19, 1995, wire services began sending urgent bulletins from Japan saying thousands of people had been sickened in the subways during their Monday morning commute by a mysterious gas or toxin.
Richard A. Clarke, the White House official who handled terrorism issues, immediately called Frank Young of the Department of Health and Human Services for a scientist's assessment of what might be unfolding in Tokyo. Clark described the early, sketchy accounts to Young, a microbiologist who headed his department's Office of Emergency Preparedness. No group had claimed responsibility for an attack. But Young surmised that someone had released sarin, a potent nerve gas, on the subway platforms. Young decided to check his impressions with Joshua Lederberg, whom he had met nearly 4 decades earlier as a graduate student. He knew just how to find him. Joshua Lederberg was part of a secret federal program known as Reach Back. That's REACH space BACK. Joshua Lederberg was part of a secret federal program known as Reach Back, a group of medical experts who wore beepers so they could be instantly consulted in the event of a terrorist attack involving chemicals or germs. Awakened from sleep in a San Antonio hotel, Lederberg was not surprised by reports of the poisonings in Tokyo. Lederberg told Frank Young, quote, "I hope it's not too bad," unquote. Lederberg wondered whether the terrorists in Tokyo had also tried out biological weapons. He said, if they were playing around with this kind of fire, how could they not be lighting that box of matches too? The next day, Clark called a meeting of the Counterterrorism Security Group, the administration's terrorism specialists. They gathered in the White House Situation Room. The reports from Tokyo were becoming clearer. As many as a dozen people were dead and thousands injured by an attack with sarin, the nerve gas Frank Young had identified. Suspicions immediately focused on an obscure religious cult, Shinrikyo. For much of the past 2 years, Clark had been trying to bring some order to the government's counterterrorism programs, which sprawled across more than 40 departments. He was an intense, obsessive man, the sort of person who, one colleague said, liked to relax in a bath while reading a few back issues of Aviation Week. Clark had a talent for getting things done and making enemies. Some in the FBI distrusted him, worried that he was too involved in the specifics of their operations. Others admired his energy. Clark already knew a lot about the dangers of biological weaponry. He had also worked in the State Department's intelligence arm in the late 1980s and was among a small group privy to the secret reports about the Soviet germ weapons program. At the White House meeting, Clark was flanked by young and career officials from the Pentagon, the FBI, and the Central Intelligence Agency. The more junior aides were perched in the strap hanger chairs around the edge of the wood-paneled room, taking notes for their bosses. The people at the table, the government's brain trust on terrorism, knew one another well. Just 35 days into Bill Clinton's presidency, they had gathered to coordinate a response to the World Trade Center bombing. Earlier in the year, the group had polished plans for the covert operation to arrest the mastermind of the attack, Ramzi Youssef. It quickly became clear that neither the CIA nor the FBI knew much about Shinrikyo, or had any idea why it might try to kill thousands of Japanese commuters. The CIA's Tokyo station had sent word that the group had an office in New York at a midtown apartment building a few blocks from Times Square. The report surprised the FBI, which had found no references to the cult in its databases on dangerous groups. Pentagon officials immediately sent soldiers from the Technical Escort Unit, which is an army outfit that, among other things, is responsible for defusing chemical or biological bombs to New York City. Perhaps the Shinrikyo members in the United States had stockpiled nerve agents in the building. James Kallstrom, the head of the FBI office in New York City, briefed Mayor Giuliani and the New York City Police Commissioner on the situation. FBI agents began a 24-hour surveillance at the apartment at 8 East 48th Street, just off Fifth Avenue. It was an anxious moment. The FBI had no idea how many people in New York belonged to the cult or where they might live. Following the group's members as they made their rounds only deepened the mystery. Each meeting added a new person to investigate. FBI agents were eager to conduct a covert search of the group's apartment. There were, however, legal obstacles to such a break-in. Shinrikyo purported to be a religion, and its members were not known to have violated any laws in the United States. The group had not hidden its presence in New York City and had filed incorporation papers with the state for USA Company Limited. The cult's operatives had even registered with New York State as a charity with the state purpose of fostering spiritual development through the study of and practice of Eastern philosophy and religion. The FBI was seeking the search warrant under the rules of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, a statute that gives investigators wide latitude in national security cases. Even so, Justice Department officials in Washington felt that the Bureau did not have enough evidence to gain approval from the secret 3-judge panel that rules on such cases. Over the next 2 days, Louis J. Free, the FBI director, repeatedly called his counterparts in Japan asking for help. None was forthcoming. Finally, FBI agents in New York City obtained enough information about the group to justify the warrant. More than 48 hours after the first news reports from Tokyo, FBI agents quietly entered the building to search for dangerous substances and plant listening devices. The Army's unit was not much help. Its best detection equipment, designed for the battlefield and mounted on a large truck, was useless in such a covert search of an apartment building on a busy midtown Manhattan street. It was not clear what the FBI agents would have done if they had found chemicals or germs. They had not informed local health officials in advance, and none of the agents wore masks or carried gear that could identify hazardous substances. Fortunately, no chemical or biological agents were discovered in the apartment. The Aum Shinrikyo branch in New York seemed to pose no threat. It had been used to procure computer software and other equipment, not to mount terrorist operations. But the incident had exposed some worrisome gaps in the government's preparations.
It took American officials several years to pry details about Aum Shinrikyo's operations from the reluctant Japanese police. The group, officials would learn, was a religious cult with $1 billion war chest and an apocalyptic theology that sanctioned mass killing.
Joshua Lederberg's guess turned out to be accurate.
Evidence emerged over several years that scientists working for Aum had tried several times to make germ weapons from anthrax and botulinum. They had staged as many as a dozen unsuccessful germ attacks in Japan from 1990 to 1995.
The failure of the intelligence agencies to detect Aum Shinrikyo's activities around the world was particularly disturbing to Clark and his White House colleagues.
The cult had tens of thousands of members in Russia and Japan, had published a statement threatening President Clinton, and hoped to hasten Armageddon by sparking a war between Russia and the United States. On a radio program it sponsored in Russia, it had broadcast statements touting the virtues of biological weapons. The 1995 subway gassings changed the thinking of many American officials. The technology to produce explosives from fertilizer could be mastered by a high school chemistry student. Few experts knew the full story of the Salmonella attack carried out a decade earlier by disciples of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. Scientists worried about copycats were still arguing over whether it was appropriate to publish a detailed account of the Oregon poisonings when the Aum attack occurred. The United States had set up a team to deal with nuclear terrorism in 1975 after an extortionist had threatened to explode a nuclear device in Boston. It was called the Nuclear Emergency Search Team. No similar unit existed to deal with chemical or biological terrorism aimed at civilians.
On the morning of March 20th, 1995, the Honolulu Advertiser carried a large color photo of Japanese authorities ministering to the victims of the Aum Shinrikyo attack. It caught the eye of General Charles Krulak. No, it's not Kulak, K-U-L-A-C-Z. It's Charles Krulak, K-R-U-L-A-K, a general who was preparing to begin his tour as commandant of the Marine Corps. He said, "I asked the question, is there anything we can do for the Japanese right now?" The answer I got was that we really had nothing. The military special operations teams, such as Delta Force, were set up to foil a terrorist attack. not deal with the aftermath. General Charles Krulak began to sketch out plans for a Marine Corps unit that would react to chemical or biological incidents. He said, "We wanted a force that would go in there, seal off the area, conduct decontamination, and treat people who were sick." Krulak hoped the new team would be ready for the 1996 Summer Olympics in Atlanta. General Krulak's views were unusual. Most senior military officials had shied away from involvement in domestic terrorism defense, fearing it would siphon money away from more traditional military operations and needs. Krulak disagreed. Dealing with bioterrorism was a way to get money, not lose it. The world was changing, and Krulak planned to use his tenure as commandant to re-examine the Marine Corps' basic assumptions. As he tried to build support for his anti-terrorism unit, which bore the unwieldy name of Chemical Biological Incident Response Force, or CBIRF, pronounced CBRIF, Krulak discovered a powerful ally in the Pentagon, and his name was Richard Danzig, the Undersecretary of the Navy. Undersecretaries are typically assigned to deal with the day-to-day businesses of running their services, budgets, base closings, and maintenance. But Richard Danzig, who had been a partner in a leading Washington law firm, had broader interests and some glittering credentials. A Rhodes Scholar and Yale Law School graduate, he had clerked for Supreme Court Justice Byron White and had been named to a senior civilian post in the Pentagon during the Carter administration at the age of 33. In 1993, shortly after he was appointed Undersecretary of the Navy, Danzig began to ponder what threats the military was overlooking. He believed that civilians at the Pentagon should be focusing on the larger strategic issues. What kind of Navy did the United States need in the post-Cold War world? What threats were being ignored? Danzig's attention turned almost immediately to the dangers of germ weapons. Despite the reforms pushed by Congress, biodefense was still scattered through several parts of the Pentagon. President Nixon's 1969 renunciation of the offensive program had undermined the powerful motivation for building defenses. Without a visceral, direct sense of what the weapons could do to an enemy, military officials lacked compelling reasons to invest in vaccines, detectors, or better protective suits. The military, Danzig discovered, was largely detached from biology, the most rapidly evolving science on the planet. Joshua Lederberg seemed to be the only biologist with any standing among Pentagon officials. And this is an important part of this book, the relationship with Joshua Lederberg in the United States military. Now, just because something is printed, that doesn't mean it's true. It only means that it's true that it was printed. So there was definitely, at the very least, a desire to communicate a belief that Joshua Lederberg had a strong relationship with the military. I have no reason to doubt that there was extensive communication. However, for some reason, based upon the evidence I have seen so far, for some reason, I suspect that the United States military really did have trust, or did have a trusted relationship with Joshua Lederberg. And that is incredibly important, especially given the fact that Joshua Lederberg is one of the most important microbiologists in the history of the United States, and perhaps the world. Danzig's staff scoured the intelligence agencies and government medical institutes for analysts and outside experts who understood biological weapons. He told them that he wanted to get smart on the intricacies of germ warfare, how the agents really worked, and what it took to disseminate them, what kind of defenses the United States could deploy. He spent hours with these experts, learning the life cycle of Bacillus anthracis and the basics of cellular biology. He sought out I. Lewis Libby, a.k.a. Scooter Libby, the Pentagon civilian who had looked closely at germ weapons issues during the Gulf War, and General John Jumper, the officer General Colin Powell had assigned to biodefense. They described how the Bush administration had scrambled to prepare for war and had fallen short. Scooter Libby recounted one of the more frightening scenarios studied during the war. What if Saddam had responded to the air campaign by announcing, "If you don't stop bombing my country and its civilian citizens, I'll use biological weapons against your civilians"? Danzig immediately thought of another, more daunting strategy that would have allowed the Iraqi leader to distance himself from the threat. Saddam could say he had learned that terrorists, acting independently and against his wishes, were plotting to attack the United States with germ weapons unless the bombing was halted. Danzig was not impressed with the military's preparations for germ warfare, for germ combat, or the effort to bring biodefense under a single office. The issue was still scattered throughout the bureaucracy. One part of the Pentagon handled training, another masks and detectors. Military leaders continued to view nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons as a single threat, as they had for decades. Danzig turned to Joshua Lederberg, whom he knew casually from his days as a Stanford University law professor. The biologist recounted his repeated failed attempts to warn Washington of a growing threat. Danzig said that Josh had been sowing seeds for decades in sterile soil. Lederberg was a brilliant analyst and conceptualizer. His ideas were often decades ahead of the conventional wisdom, but he was not much of a showman, Danzig thought. His explanations of the biological threat could be pedantic, dense with details that overwhelmed his audience. And Lederberg's main problem, Danzig concluded, was that nobody was working the bureaucracy from the inside. It was a job Danzig relished. He had begun his second stint at the Pentagon with a clear sense of how to change entrenched bureaucracies. You had to sell the leadership on new ideas, take them on an intellectual journey. The temptation in any large organization was to give orders, to impose your will through rank. Danzig was looking for converts. He wanted to walk military officers through the logic that had persuaded him of the danger of biological weapons. He understood that he would succeed only with the wholehearted support of the nation's senior military officials, the leaders of the four services. They would be a tough sell. Germ defenses were about planning for a contingency that might never happen. Meanwhile, the services faced expensive real-world problems with immediate implications. The Army's outmoded trucks needed to be replaced, enlisted men were underpaid, the Navy's fleet was shrinking. From conversations with experts and intelligence officers, Danzig assembled a detailed presentation on the threat posed by biological weapons. He asked Joshua Lederberg to vet the scientific arguments. One of the first audiences was a group of about 20 Marine Corps generals. They were respectful but skeptical. Danzig left the room certain that he had not persuaded any of them. Danzig sharpened the presentation and began meeting with top civilian and military leaders from all services, 10 or 12 people at a time. His talk was designed like a legal brief. It began with basic science, the ease with which a nation with a pharmaceutical industry and a few crop dusters could create a terrifying weapon. It moved on to specifics. Danzig would project a slide showing the troop and ship deployments on a particular day in the Gulf War and walk the officers through an anthrax attack by a small plane or a boat. Using the Socratic method he favored as a professor, Danzig led the officers through a scenario in which germ terrorists attacked Washington, D.C. One official recalled, "There were a whole lot of what-ifs." Danzig made the case that investments in the millions, not billions, could help. The military needed anthrax inoculations, more intelligence, better analysis. The seminars, which stretched through 1994 and into 1995, were jointly run by Danzig and Admiral William Owens, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and another of the Pentagon's most innovative thinkers. The two Rhodes Scholars had worked closely together on a number of issues, but Owens was not sold on the germ threat. He was particularly skeptical of the push to vaccinate select troops against anthrax. Owens had an array of arguments against the program. The vaccinations would be militarily useless. If the United States inoculated its forces against anthrax, he told colleagues, adversaries would just shift to botulinum or some other agent. Anthrax vaccinations would complicate the delicate diplomacy of coalition building. How could the United States persuade allies with unprotected troops to join an international alliance as it had for the Gulf War? More fundamentally, Owens believed that inoculations would touch off a biological arms race. He proposed a radical alternative. The United States should issue a public statement threatening nuclear retaliation against anyone who used germ weapons against Americans. The prospect of nuclear annihilation, he told colleagues, had certainly gotten Saddam Hussein's attention. Owens saw biological defense as folly. You can't protect everybody, he told colleagues. The military would never order the immunization of servicemen's families. Nor would American officials demand that every American take the anthrax shots. Oh, man. Oh, wow. Times have changed. Nor would officials... I just have to read that one a second time. Nor would American officials demand that every American take the anthrax shots. Owens clashed with the medical experts who were pushing the program, particularly Stephen Joseph, the New York physician who took over as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs in early 1994. By the way, before I even go on, this guy sounds interesting. Stephen Joseph. Who is Stephen Joseph? He does have a Wikipedia page. Stephen Carl Joseph, born New York City, was the New York City Health Commissioner from 1986 to 1990 after having worked at the United Nations Children's Fund, or UNICEF, as Special Coordinator for Child Health and Survival. He went on to become the Dean of Public Schools of the University of Minnesota and Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs. He went to Harvard, he went to Tufts, medical degree from Yale 1963, Masters of Public Health, Johns Hopkins 1968. As New York City Health Commissioner, Joseph was credited with aggressively fighting the AIDS epidemic there. And he wrote 3 books, including Dragon Within the Gates, The Once and Future AIDS Epidemic. If I click on New York City Health Commissioner, the current New York City Health Commissioner is Michelle Morse. But we actually can get a list of the history of the New York City Health Commissioners. And we see that Stephen Joseph was the New York City Health Commissioner from March of 1986 to March of 1990, about 4 years. Then Woody Myers for 2 years, and then Margaret Hamburg from June 11th, 1991 till 1997. So one of the longest-running New York City Health Commissioners in recent history was Margaret Hamburg, or Peggy Hamburg. There we go. So the Charlie Rose Show, this was June 20th, 1996.
World have gotten together to call attention to a medical matter not getting the attention it deserves. Infectious diseases, once thought to be a thing of the past, are making a big comeback due to factors like genetic evolution, misuse of antibiotics, and increased mobility of the population. Deaths from infectious diseases took a 58% jump between 1980 and 1992. Joining me now to look at the cause of this increase and what it means for all of us is Nobel laureate Dr. Joshua Lederberg. He is Professor Emeritus of Rockefeller University and a contributor to this month's Journal of the American Medical Association. Also, Margaret Hamburg, the Health Commissioner of New York. Dr. Hamburg is a graduate of Harvard Medical School. Thank you both for coming. Dr. Lederberg, in your most alarmist, give me the extreme as to what the fear is, because you have pointed to, flu epidemic, I think 1918. As a possible model as to what could happen if certain factors came together.
Not that.
Well, that's the most tangible example of the sort of pandemic that I think we can very reasonably expect to happen again. What the mortality outcome will be will depend very much on the kind of preparations that we make for it. At that time, when we had a population less than half of what we have today, 500,000 Americans died. Over 20 million people died around the world. There were as many casualties from the flu as there were from combat during all of World War I.
When we look at things like the movie Outbreak all of the attention.
His numbers are from the United States are correct. Worldwide, I would contest that. He's sort of lumping in still the death toll from India. But I will note that this is 1996, and the current number is 50 million. So if Anthony Fauci's in front of Congress, he'll say 50 million worldwide. So I guess at some point they unearthed an extra 30 million graves that they missed.
To this in the popular press, as well as the Journal of the American Medical Association just at January.
And of course, the movie Outbreak with Dustin Hoffman, Morgan Freeman, that came out in 1995. And again, the movie Outbreak opens with a quote on the screen from Joshua Lederberg. So even Hollywood movies at the opening scene will put a Joshua Lederberg quote. That's pretty impressive, given the fact that most people don't know who this guy is anymore. That his history has been kind of buried. Not totally, because, I mean, it's too serious and too wide-reaching to hide it completely. But very few people, almost no one in the research community outside of currently Jonathan Cooey ever mentions Lederberg. So the point here is that this is Lederberg in this 1996 interview with Charlie Rose. And here, Lederberg is side by side with Margaret Hamburg, who at that time becomes the New York City Health Commissioner. So Lederberg maintains a pretty frequent working relationship with New York City Health Commissioners. Now, I don't mean this to besmirch the resume or the capabilities of Margaret Hamburg, but she got the job really young with really not much experience. I think it might have had something to do with her dad running the Carnegie Institute and being one of the most influential people for the United States in its nuclear disarmament negotiations with Russia. I know that Margaret Hamburg's college entrance letter or recommendation letter, I think she went to Duke, was written by Joshua Lederberg. So in some ways, he's a mentor of her in a way. But I think it's a far more complicated relationship than that. I'm not saying, I'm not at all, is there a romantic relationship here? But I think that there's a very complicated, let's just say, influence relationship ongoing here. But the New York City Health Commissioner role is very important. So in this book, Germs, going back to the book Germs, I just wanted to highlight that, again, we have someone getting involved in a very high-level role with respect to biological defense or bioterrorism preparations, and yet another New York City Health Commissioner, in this case, Stephen Joseph, who we know very little about. His Wikipedia page is very sparse at best, but it is noteworthy. Again, the New York City Health Commissioner role is involved.
Now that we had that brief review of Stephen Joseph, let's just restart that paragraph.
Owens clashed with the medical experts who were pushing the program, particularly Stephen Joseph, the New York physician who took over as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs in early 1994. By the way, before I even go on, this guy sounds interesting. Stephen Joseph. Who is Stephen Joseph? He's clashed with the medical experts who were pushing the program, particularly Stephen Joseph, the New York physician who took over as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs in early 1994. Owens believed that researchers were moving closer to producing a multivalent vaccine, a single shot that protects against multiple diseases, and wanted to defer vaccinations until the new vaccine was available. He repeatedly asked whether the existing anthrax vaccine was safe, whether it interacted with other drugs or caused dangerous side effects. The answers did not satisfy him. Owens later said, quote, "I never felt we got the complete assurance that we were completely safe to vaccinate," unquote. Joseph, a former New York City Health Commissioner, knew that it would be hard to persuade Owens and his colleagues in uniform. Biodefense was an alien concept to them. The threat was theoretical. In a time of shrinking budgets, germ defense took money away from tanks and trucks. But to Joseph and the Pentagon health experts, the decision to vaccinate against anthrax was straightforward and a no-brainer. He believed a multivalent vaccine was decades away at best and might never be produced. American servicemen needed protection against germ attack now. Joseph understood the reluctance of military officers to grapple with the issue. If they accepted the biological threat as real, their entire concept of warfare would have to change. Danzig was challenging Pentagon officials to do just that, to begin incorporating the possibility of biological attack into their operational planning. The military patrols the airspace above large public gatherings, such as the Olympics. Danzig suggested that the cordon be expanded to protect against the downwind release of a biological weapon by a crop duster or a small plane. The Joint Chiefs invited him to watch an exercise in which commandos practiced an assault on a terrorist safe house in which biological weapons were stored. Danzig was impressed by the efficiency of the nighttime attack, which began with stun grenades and ended with a well-choreographed rush to the target. But he noted with dismay that some of the soldiers mounting the attack had trampled on test tubes that supposedly contained the agent, crushing them beneath their combat boots, releasing their contents.
On April 19, 1995, a month after Aum's attack in Tokyo, the Clinton administration was staggered by the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrow Federal Building in Oklahoma City. The attack killed nearly 200 people, including many children. Days later, the FBI began investigating a videotape that warned of a chemical attack against visitors to Disneyland over Easter weekend. The tape showed hands mixing chemicals. Federal agents swarmed over the amusement park. The person or persons who sent the tape were never found.
John Sopko, that's S-O-P-K-O, John Sopko, a senior Senate investigator, was not thinking much about terrorism when he went to the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency for briefings later that month. A former federal prosecutor who had specialized in mob cases in Cleveland, John Sopko worked for the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. He was at DIA, again, that's Defense Intelligence Agency, to gather information on a subject that his boss, Senator Sam Nunn, had made a personal crusade, Russia's diminishing control over its nuclear arsenal. Scientists working for Russia's interlocking network of civilian and military research institutes were poorly paid, vulnerable to recruitment by aspiring nuclear powers. The Defense Intelligence Agency intelligence official he spoke of, the DIA intelligence official he spoke with, mentioned that I.V. Kurchatov, and that's spelled K-U-R-C-H-A-T-O-V. Again, the DIA intelligence official he spoke with mentioned I.V. Kurchatov, Institute of Atomic Energy, named for the father of the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons program. The DIA official said, "You know that the Aum Shenrikyo was there," referring to the presence of Aum Shenrikyo's followers among the Russian scientists. The Aum, John Sopko said in a puzzled way, "You know, the guys who did the subway gassing in Japan." Until that moment, John Sopko had not seen the Aum Shenrikyo story as anything more than an international oddity. He pressed for more information. Why had a Japanese religious cult penetrated one of Russia's premier weapons laboratories? The answers were sketchy. John Sopko returned to the capital with a new idea. The subcommittee's next round of hearings should examine the Tokyo attack. Senator Sam Nunn agreed, as did the Republican majority, and the panel staff immediately began to investigate the issue, asking for briefings from the intelligence agencies and others in the government. The size and scope of Aum Shenrikyo's operations stunned John Sopko, and he was even more startled by the government's lack of information. Few government analysts knew anything about the cult. John Sopko did his own research. He obtained police records from Australia and Japan, interviewed witnesses, and studied press articles. What he discovered alarmed him. Aum Shenrikyo, he learned, had been founded in the late 1980s by Shoko Asahara, a half-blind Japanese guru who had earned a fortune running a chain of meditation centers. A bearded man with flowing black hair and claims of supernatural powers, Asahara saw himself as a messiah who would lead his followers to safety as the end of the world drew near. The group's name was drawn from the Indian meditation chant Om, O-M, and a Japanese word that means supreme truth. Its membership ran the gamut, from lost souls to Japan's elites, biochemists, doctors, even a few Japanese police officers. Om charged its members steep fees, and by 1995, its holdings in land, cash, and gold bars totaled more than $1 billion. Worldwide, Om had 50,000 members in 6 countries. John Sopko learned that Om's sarin gas had been produced by its health and welfare minister, Seiichi Endo, who had done graduate work in chemistry and molecular biology. The group's ambitions went well beyond nerve gas. It had built sophisticated laboratories and tried to produce weapons from anthrax, botulinum, and Q fever. An Om Shinrikyo member had already confessed to the Japanese authorities that in 1993, the cult had tried to spray anthrax germs from an improvised aerosol device on the roof of a building Om owned in downtown Tokyo. The Om case looked like a serious American intelligence failure. FBI and CIA officials privately told John Sopko that they had not seriously begun collecting information on the cult until September 1995, months after Senator Sam Nunn announced that the Senate would hold hearings on the subway attack. The agencies, John Sopko discovered, had missed clear warnings that something was afoot in Japan. As early as 1993, a Connecticut company had notified the United States Customs Service that a Japanese publishing company called Om Shinrikyo was trying to buy an interferometer, which is a device used to make very accurate measurements of small objects. The export of such equipment is restricted because it can be used for making nuclear bombs. And Om Shinrikyo ultimately abandoned the purchase. But no one in the American government had recognized the danger or pressed for an explanation of why a Japanese publishing company would want such equipment. A year later, in 1994, Japanese newspapers carried stories about a poisoning with sarin gas in the provincial capital of Matsumoto that left 7 people dead and dozens injured. The incident fascinated John Sopko because it seemed to be a harbinger of Om Shinrikyo's 1995 attack in the Tokyo subways. American intelligence agencies did not look closely at the Matsumoto gassing, which was blamed on a local resident who had supposedly produced sarin while trying to make home-brewed pesticides. The incident, however, obsessed the Japanese press and, beginning in late 1994, a Washington-based consultant who specialized in chemical weapons. The consultant, named Kyle Olson, was hired by a Japanese television network to review the purported accident. He traveled to Japan, interviewed the suspect himself, and found the authorities' explanation scientifically improbable. Producing sarin is an exacting process, not something that can be done accidentally. On the long flight back to the United States in late December of 1994, Kyle Olson hunched over his laptop and pounded out a warning for officials in Washington. The Matsumoto case was no accident, he wrote. It was terrorism. It read, quote, "It is not far-fetched to postulate a small group of persons, their motivations being beyond the scope of this paper, carefully tested and evaluated the effectiveness of a weapon based on technology with which they were unfamiliar. Such testing would be prudent prior to planning a major strike, both to prevent accidents and to assure maximum effectiveness. It may also be that the unknown nature of the hand wielding the weapon was part of the group's strategy, or perhaps a desire for optimum surprise and shock."
This is a 1-minute interview of Kyle Olson from AP 1995.
And I began to reach the conclusion that this was a dress rehearsal of some kind, that someone was trying to get the hang of using a new weapon. It was at that point that I began talking up in the written media to the public and also talking to some government officials that, one, this was a preparatory stage, not the final event, and that the biggest target that I could see in Japan was probably the Tokyo subway system, and probably at a rush hour. Unfortunately, there's really not much you can do. You can't live your life wearing a neoprene. I don't think the weapons that have been used in Tokyo are military. I think that there are some very strong indications that they're homemade. It's got to hit home. Kasumigaseki is literally only about... This represents the first time that terrorists have taken that step across the threshold into the use of weapons of mass destruction. Officials in the intelligence community and the policing communities have been afraid for a long time that something like this might happen. And I'm afraid that what we've seen is an upping of the ante. I don't think that we can really afford not to be concerned about the prospects that chemical or even biological weapons might not find their way into terrorist attacks in the future.
Kyle Olson made a prediction. He said, quote, "The persons responsible for Matsumoto certainly understand now that a significant quantity of nerve gas delivered into a warm, crowded urban area, such as a Ginza department store or major subway station, could have catastrophic consequences. The Matsumoto incident has generally been referred to by authorities and the media in Japan as the accident. There is compelling evidence that whatever the complete story of the deadly June night turns out to be, the events in that quiet city were anything but accidental. This case deserves further attention as the potential harbinger of the next phase of terrorist horror," unquote. Kyle Olson circulated the document to friends in the government, including at the CIA and in the White House. Nothing happened. A few weeks later, he published the paper in a newsletter distributed by his think tank to several hundred government experts on intelligence and arms control. No one called to ask for more details. Kyle Olson said, "Some of the people I gave it to said, 'Gee, that's interesting,' and they'd pat me on the head and they'd send me on my way. I got so little reaction, I put it on the shelf and I said, 'I've done what I can.'" But John Sopko understood the power of Kyle Olson's story. It would make arresting testimony at the hearings Senator Sam Nunn's committee planned to hold in the fall.
On June 21, 1995, President Clinton signed a secret directive on counterterrorism, the results of a far-reaching review that had begun 2 years earlier after the World Trade Center bombing. Presidential Decision Directive 39 delineated the agencies that were to play the lead roles in handling terrorist incidents. The State Department overseas and the FBI inside the United States. Clinton ordered the Federal Emergency Management Agency to update its planning for terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction. Tacked on just before Clinton's signature was a sentence drafted by Dick Clark. "The United States shall give highest priority to developing effective capabilities to detect, prevent, defeat, and manage the consequences of a nuclear, biological, or chemical materials or weapons use by terrorists." A few days later, nearly 400 officials from the United States, Canada, Britain, and Japan met in Bethesda, Maryland, for a closed-door seminar on how those words might be turned into reality.
Frank Young and Bill Clark, the Health and Human Services officials, had planned the 3-day meeting long before the Tokyo subway gassing, but Aum Shinrikyo was weighing heavily on the minds of everyone who attended.
Philip C. Wilcox, Jr., the State Department's coordinator for counterterrorism, told a packed auditorium, "The copycat phenomenon, which we worry about a great deal in counterterrorism, is a real risk here. Once it has happened, others will take their cue and try it again. Once the barrier has been breached, what was originally unthinkable now becomes more likely." Several leading scientists spoke to the group, including Josh Lederberg. But it was Bill Patrick's presentation that provided some of the most chilling moments of the three-day meeting. Speaking in his usual relaxed conversational tone, he detailed how a terrorist could mount a germ attack on the World Trade Center using a blender, cheesecloth, a garden sprayer, and some widely available hospital supplies. Patrick gave several scenarios, including an attack with Francisella tularensis, a favorite agent of the defunct American offensive program and a germ that the Rajneeshis had ordered. It would take the terrorist about 36 hours to brew 5 liters of bacterial solution containing swarms of germs, about 500 million cells per milliliter. An infectious dose of the bacteria, Patrick said, was about 50 cells per milliliter. A terrorist who loaded the mixture into a garden sprayer, then aimed that sprayer at the building's air intakes, would, in a few minutes, disseminate enough agent to infect half the people in the World Trade Center. Patrick said, "My conclusion today is not if terrorists will use a biological weapon, but when and where." There were few questions after the retired germ scientist finished his presentation. No one seemed to know what to say. One official asked if there was anything local authorities could do to protect Americans other than foiling terrorists before they could attack. How do we react to something like this when and if an event occurs? If it is an honest-to-goodness terrorist who knows what he is doing, Patrick replied, your probability of defeating him is very slim.
Michael A. Jacob, that's Jakub, an official with the State Department's Counterterrorism Office, closed the conference with a more uplifting assessment. For years, Jacob said, senior government officials had dismissed the dangers of chemical or biological attack. Those who dared raise the issue, he said, were told, quote, "Here is a cookie. Go back to bed. Get out of my hair." Recent events had changed everything, propelling the issue to the top of the national agenda. Now, he said, those same officials were saying, "Tell me what needs to be done, and I will help you do it." And Chapter 6 ends on page 241, and that corresponds to 56 minutes, 50 seconds of Chapter 3 of the audiobook. 60 to 70% of this chapter, for whatever reason, was not included in the audiobook. And that concludes episode 280.6, which corresponds to chapter 6 in the book. Episode 280.7 will follow this episode, which will correspond to chapter 7 in the book, titled Evil Empire, which begins in the book on page 242. Thank you very much, and we will see you next time.